Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to welcome all of you to today's Product Salon and Fireside Chat. I'm Ken Fine, the CEO of Heap. I'll be your host today. Before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, as a reminder, all participants are muted. If you have any follow-up questions, please post them in the chat or email marketing@heap.io. A recording of this session will be mailed to all attendees. And let's get started. Without further ado, I'm very excited to be talking today with my friend Dan Olsen. Dan and I go way back. We were engineers and naval officers together a long time ago. Today, Dan is a product management trainer, consultant, speaker, and general expert. He wrote the best-selling product management book, The Lean Product Playbook. Through his interactive training workshops, Dan helps companies build great products and strong product teams. He's also the founder of the 11,000-member Lean Product Meetup community. During today's conversation, we're going to talk about the value of integrating your quantitative analysis techniques with your qualitative insights and techniques to build, in total, best-in-class products. We'll cover the strengths and the weaknesses of each different approach in the context of looking for product market fit and for scaling products thereafter. Let's get started. Dan, it's great to have you here. Very excited to have you sharing your perspective with us. Would you be able to take a minute and introduce yourself to the audience and then share some of your perspective, best practices, and insights related to combining best-in-class quantitative approaches with qualitative approaches?
Yeah, Ken, I'd be happy to. It's a real pleasure to be here to do an event with you. We've known each other for a long time. So let me share my screen. I'm happy to be talking today about how we can integrate our quant and qual insights to build successful products. Real quick about my background, I started out in engineering, coding as a kid. And then, as you said, our first jobs out of college were working together at the same place, designing nuclear submarines, which was an awesome job. And then, like you, I went to Stanford Business School after doing that. And then at business school, trying to figure out what I was going to do after graduation, I learned about this emerging career called product management. And the more I learned about it, the more exciting it sounded. I asked people where the best place to learn product management was, since I had never done it. And everybody pretty much said Intuit. So I was fortunate to get a job at Intuit. And then I was a product leader at several startups. I wrote the Lean Product Playbook, as you mentioned. And I'm a founder of that meetup. And I've been doing this for a while, consulting and training. So I've had a chance to work with a lot of companies over the years. And that's really kind of provided me a big data set of what different teams are doing with quant and qual insights, how they're using it, what's working well and what's not. So, and I like to couch what we're going to be talking about in terms of product market fit. Product market fit is a term that I'm sure most people on the webinar are familiar with. It was coined by Mark Andreessen back in 2007. And just means basically like your product is solving real customer problems in a way that's better than the other products that are out there. Like it's really creating customer value. Right. And I want to start off with a little story of a product that I worked on where we were trying to achieve product market fit. And we knew that, hey, if you want to achieve product market fit, you have to be customer centric. You have to get out of the building and talk to customers and do some research. And so we went out and we talked to customers and asked them to describe the product that would be ideal for them. And this is how they described the product to us. Now, the product manager didn't quite hear the same thing. They heard something a little different. And this is how they envisioned the product. But we felt like we had a good handle on what we needed to do. So we started working with the team towards our alpha milestone, the alpha version. And we got to the alpha version. There were some issues. It didn't really work as intended, but we totally pivoted, iterated. The beta version was fine. We fixed the issues. It worked fine. We, of course, work with our dev partners to try to come up with a launch date, the deadline that we could hit it. We unfortunately did not hit the date. This was the only thing that was ready by the original launch date. As we approached launch, marketing got involved. Here's how they marketed the product to the world. And then after we launched the product, then the sales team got involved. And here's how they sold the product to the world. And here's what the customer wanted the whole time, right? So it's just a funny little cartoon strip that illustrates the challenges when you're trying to achieve product market fit. It's difficult, right? You've all heard the statistics that like 80% of new products fail or 90% of new products fail, depending on the survey that on the research that you look at. And it's hard, right? You've got to like listen to customers. They're not necessarily the best at describing their needs and wants. You've got to articulate that to your cross-functional team members and work together to design and develop a product. Hopefully that what comes out that you launch, actually meets customer needs. And so, but most of my work is about how to think about product market fit, how to achieve product market fit. And the way I think about it at a high level is that there are three phases that your product can be in. There's before you achieve a certain level of product market fit, right? And so phase one is before your product's even live. Obviously, you can't have product market fit if your product isn't live. But I would also argue that in phase two, which is after you launch your product, most products, when they launch, do not have product market fit, right? Despite their best efforts, most of them just don't, right? There are things you can do to de-risk your product in phase one, but at the end of the day, phase two is where you really can take it to the next level as far as product market fit goes. And then if you're fortunate, your product, achieves enough product market fit that you can get to phase three, right? And it's not like it's a binary threshold of you hit a certain level of product market fit or not. It's really more like, you reach a good enough level. And let me quantify these phases basically with a scale here. And the number doesn't really matter. Number of customers or revenue from 0 to a lot, for whatever a lot is for your business. Obviously, before you launch, you have 0 customers and 0 revenue. Once you launch, you start to get some customers and hopefully generate some revenue, but it's not a whole lot. And then that's the key thing about phase three is that you've got enough product market fit that you hit an inflection point, and you hear people talk about a hockey stick. That's where, your product is creating enough value that it's really growing and starting to take off. That's kind of how I think about the three phases. And one thing that I see happen is someone may read a blog post or see a video with some hack or tip on what they did for their product, and then they go to try to apply it on their own product, and it doesn't work. And one of the reasons that happens is you're probably in a different phase than the person that wrote the tip. So especially in phase three, you see a lot of growth hacking tips, but if you try to apply them in phase one or phase two, they may not work out because you're not in the same phase. And when there's a lot of uncertainty, going back to that cartoon strip, there's a lot of uncertainty when you're trying to achieve product market fit. And there are two kind of fundamentally different ways of doing research to minimize that uncertainty and learn, right? And those two ways are qualitative and quantitative. And that's what we're here to talk about today, right? So I just want to describe at a high level what each of these is really all about, right? So qualitative research or learning, you actually care about what each person has to say. You want to sit down one-on-one with them and talk to them and have an interactive conversation with them, right? To really understand the nuances of what their problems are, what they care about, what's important to them. And you're not going to hit statistical significance when you're doing qualitative research, right? It's just you're talking to a certain number of people. Even if you talk to 10 or 20 or 30, you're still not going to get statistical significance, right? So just to make this interesting and more memorable, I like to personify each of these approaches with someone. And in this case, it's someone from television. So if you think about from television, who's really good at sitting down with someone one-on-one and staring into their eyes and interviewing them and getting them to open up, it's Oprah Winfrey, right? There are people that have interviewed with her and they cried and they felt like she was staring into their soul, and they cried in a good way because she got them to open up, right? So that's kind of the qualitative approach, is kind of personified by Oprah, where each user is a snowflake. Of course, we want a pattern match across multiple users, but you actually want that rich nuance of data. In contrast, in quantitative, not to be crass, but you don't care about any one user. You want thousands of data points, hundreds of thousands, millions of data points, so you can average them, right? Look at the distribution and get statistical significance, right? So it's very different mindset. There's very different mindsets. And again, to make it fun and interesting, I like to personify this. This time it's a fictional character from TV and movies, like the master of logic and analysis, Spock, right? So you can think about Spock, right? He wants data. He wants a lot of data. He wants to prove things and use math and analytics, basically, right? So we have these two very different approaches, and sometimes companies have a preference for one or the other. It's kind of baked into their DNA, often from their founding team, that they have a preference for one or the other. And let's go back to these three phases now and talk about kind of how these fit together, right? So in phase one, before a product is live, what is our main goal? Well, our main goal, there's tons of uncertainty, and we're making all these hypotheses. So we want to test our hypotheses so that we can gain confidence before we go and invest in building something, right? And honestly, this is mainly qualitative, in my opinion, right? And this is what I advocate in my book and my lean product process, right? It's mainly qualitative. You don't even have a live product yet, so you can't do any product analytics yet per se, right? Now, after you launch in phase two, what's our goal? Well, we're most certainly not at the level of product market fit that we want. Maybe by doing a good job in phase one, we've gotten closer than we would have. But now we've got our product out there and users are really kicking the tires. Our goal is to improve our product market fit. Now, here what I recommend is a mix of qualitative and quantitative, right? We still want to have qualitative because we still need to get those deep insights into who's really using our product and why, and the people that aren't going for it, why not? But now we can start to take advantage of quantitative techniques as well. We can look at product analytics and see what are people actually doing, how frequently are they doing it, where are they dropping off, things like that. And then in phase 3, what's the goal? Well, we've achieved a decent level of product market fit. The goal is really growth. People like what we've got here, right? So we want to grow it, get as many people using it as possible, grow users, grow revenue. And here you can mainly lean on quantitative techniques. Like I said, a lot of the growth hacks you hear about, they're in phase 3, right? Especially like gaming or e-commerce companies. It's very powerful to use quantitative techniques. Like an e-commerce company, you may come up with some tweak or change and instantly see a 5% increase in revenue, right? Then I say mainly quantitative because you don't want to go 100% quantitative. You always want to maintain some qualitative insight of what's going on with your users, right? And basically, so again, some people have a preference for one or the other. The reality is they complement each other, and I'm sure in the examples that Ken and I are going to discuss, we're going to see this complement happening, right? Basically, quant will tell you what are users doing, how many are doing it, right? You may have a certain page that you want people to convert on, and it's like, okay, we can see that 30% of people are converting, and we've got so many data points, it's statistically significant. That's good to know, but we have no idea why that 30% is getting through and why the other 70% are not getting through, right? That's where qualitative comes in. It tells you why. You talk to people and you get to ask them, hey, what's going on this page where you're not being able to get through? And you'll get reasons, right? So sometimes you start in quant and you go to qual. Sometimes you start in qual and go to quant, right? And so they complement each other to kind of help you achieve product market fit. And we've got this duality of quant and quant. If we zoom out even more, there's a great framework from Christian Rohr, who's a UX leader. There's his website right there, where he takes qualitative and quantitative and he combines it with another dimensions of attitudinal and behavioral. Now, attitudinal is what people tell you, and behavioral is what they actually do. So if I asked you how often you go to the gym, you might say every week. But if I observed your behavior, it might be more like once a month, right? That's a difference, right? And he's got a blown out version of this. It's got over 20 methodologies plotted with color coding and symbols. I just want to keep it a little simple and talk about what lives in each of these 4 quadrants, each of these 4 corners, right? So down here in bottom left, qualitative attitudinal, this means we're talking to people one-on-one and we're hearing their attitudes, right? This basically is like user interviews. If you go out and interview people, do discovery interviews, this is what you're going to get. This is also where voice of customer feedback was, right? People are giving you comments, right? And writing comments and sharing their opinions with you. In this upper left quadrant, we've got qualitative, but it's behavioral. So we're kind of observing people, one at a time, but we're observing their behavior, not listening to what they say. This is where like pure usability testing would live. You're watching them use your product, right? So you're watching their behavior. This is also where session recording lives, right? You're actually watching users' behavior. Now, the reality is anytime you do usability testing, you're going to get a mix of behavioral data and attitudinal data. People are going to share their opinions as they're going through the user test, basically, right? Now, on the bottom right, we've got quantitative. So now we're not actually talking to each user one-on-one like Oprah, and we've got attitudinal. So it's a method, a way of getting many customers' opinions at scale. This is where surveys live, right? And the most popular survey is, Net Promoter Score, and everybody's probably familiar with that. And I would just quickly say surveys are interesting. There's a reason Net Promoter Score is so popular, because it has one question. It gives you like no degrees of freedom. All you get to do is insert the name of your product, and then the answer scale is determined as well, right? From 0 to 10. How likely are you to recommend this product to a friend, right? So surveys I've seen a lot of ways where they can be misused, but Net Promoter Score can be a great way to kind of see what's going on quantitatively with your NPS. But then again, you want to get the qual, like, why did you give us a 10? Why did you give us a 1, right? And then finally, in the upper right quadrant, we have quantitative. So collecting data at scale from many users, and behavioral. This is where analytics, A/B testing, and experimentation live, right? You're actually looking at real data of user behavior. What are they actually doing on your site? So again, these are all the tools, not all the tools, but these are a kind of a way to break down the different tools that are available to us as we're trying to achieve product market fit and validate our hypotheses. Now, in the Oprah qualitative world, in phase 1, I have a whole process in my other talks and in my book called The Lean Product Process to guide you through that. There's so much uncertainty about who our customer really is, what are their needs, and things like that, that it's more of a qualitative process. But what I want to do today, going forward here, is just focus quickly on the analytical side. So we're going to get our Spock on and talk about the process that I have for the Spock side, which is post-launch, you're trying to apply quantitative techniques. So the first step of the process is identifying what are the metrics that we care about, right? And the second step is let's start measuring those and make sure we have accurate baseline, what I call baseline values, right? We've got accurate tracking. There might be a little bit of kind of what I call metrics hygiene in there, where you think you're tracking something, but then you realize it's like double counting in the events or something like that. And then once you've got accurate baselines, then you can look across all your metrics and say, okay, as a team, which metric do we think we should focus on? Which one offers the highest ROI from where we are in the business? And this is all happening at the global level for your product. And then once you pick a specific metric, then you say, okay, we're going to try to improve this conversion rate. Then you go into a metric specific optimization loop where you say, okay, we're going to focus this conversion rate. Let's brainstorm all the different ideas we have for how we can improve that metric. Let's run an ROI analysis to identify the highest ROI idea. Let's go design, implement it, and roll it out. And then let's see how the metric changes. And hopefully the metric goes up and to the right, but even if it doesn't, you're going to learn from that experiment. You're going to try something else. You're going to try something else. Eventually, you're going to move the needle on that metric. You're going to have other ideas to move the needle. Over time, you're going to experience diminishing returns, right? You're going to knock out the easy stuff first, and it's going to get harder over time. At some point, it may make more sense to say, you know what, I feel like we've optimized that metric enough. Let's go back to our global dashboard and now say, given where we are with that metric, what's the next metric that now is the biggest ROI, right? And the last thing I want to close out with here is basically a high-level framework. Sometimes people feel overwhelmed with all the metrics that one could track or that are available. And so there's one high-level holistic framework that I really like that helps people stay grounded, and that's Dave McClure's startup metric for pirates, also called R, AARRR, because there are 5 metrics in it, and that's the acronym for the metrics, right? So I just want to quickly give an overview of this, and then we'll switch to talking and doing the fireside chat here. But basically, the first A is acquisition. And a way to think about this is, how do we get someone who's not really familiar with our product or brand from being there to being like on our front doorstep where they could become a customer, right? That's basically getting prospect, what we call prospective customers or prospects. How do we acquire those? The next one is activation, which is, okay, that's the process of converting those prospects into customers, right? And this is also called conversion, but if it was conversion, then the acronym will be ACCR. It wouldn't quite sound as piratey as R. So activation and conversion are kind of synonymous. And then once people are customers, they're using your product. And hopefully they keep using your product. That's where the third word comes in, retention, right? What percentage of customers are remaining active over time? The fourth one, and I forgot to say, the beauty of this framework is it applies to every business. That's the beauty. It's universal, right? The next one, referral, what this means is, hey, by virtue of people using our product, we're generating new prospects, either because it's word of mouth or because we have some real digital viral channel, like people are inviting other users or sending things to other users. This, of the 5 areas, this is the one that varies the most, right? If you're a social app, this could be very important. If you're some B2B app, maybe not so much, right? And then the final one is R, is revenue, right? By virtue of people using your product, you're generating revenue either because they're paying you directly or you're monetizing some other way. And then, in my practice, I've added a 6th one. Dave's framework was focused more on startups where you're focusing on revenue. When I work with some bigger companies, there are parts of the organization that are focusing on reducing cost or decreasing, increasing profitability, basically, right? So what you can do, the idea is across these 6 areas, at any given time in your business, there's going to be one metric that's going to offer the highest ROI based on where you are. And I call that basically the metric that matters most, or MTMM for short. So what you want to do is figure out for where we are today with our business, which of these areas is where we should be investing that's going to have the highest ROI for our business. So I just want to share these high-level frameworks. Real quick, I want to share, Ken mentioned that I founded the Lean Product Meetup 8.5 years ago. We've got over 11,000 members now. We have monthly meetups where I bring in top speakers. So you can go to that meetup and join for free if you want. And with that, I just want to thank you for listening to my slides. If you have any feedback on the talk or session, you can go to this QR code or you can go to that URL. And I'm happy to connect and happy to start a fireside chat with Ken.
My first question is, to some degree, a summary, or to ask you to summarize the broader strokes of what you just shared. New products or features clearly have lots of unknowns and uncertainty. And many of them either don't succeed or don't achieve the degree of success that the creator or the business wanted, at least in version 1. If you were to try and summarize what you just shared with us in terms of how people can best, and businesses and PMs and marketers can best increase their odds of success, what are some of your pithy points of wisdom?
Definitely. And that's the thing is, yeah, and that's a good way to say it. It's kind of harsh to say 80% of products fail. It's like, well, did they fail? It's like, well, they didn't achieve the goals that they were set out to achieve. We can say it that way, right? And that's why it's important to do goals at the beginning, because the human mind is great at revisionist history. Like if you don't agree on a goal target ahead of time and then you launch your product, it's like, yeah, we got a 10% conversion rate. That sounds pretty good, right, guys? Yeah, team, yeah, that's good, right? But ahead of time, we would have been like, no, we wanted 50% or something, right? So, and I do like the way you think, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that a lot of times people don't appreciate the uncertainty. They're kind of blind to the uncertainty. They have a vision and they pursue it. And so, what I try to do is, and several people I've worked with or seen my talks is like, hey, it sounds like you're trying to apply something like the scientific method to product development or product management. And that's pretty much kind of what I'm trying to do, where you acknowledge what you don't know. You acknowledge that this is a hypothesis. You try to say, okay, how much uncertainty do we have on each of these key hypotheses? And then you basically proactively go and say, okay, let's get how could we reduce this uncertainty? How could we get data or evidence to firm this up and see if we're right or if we're wrong or if we need a course correct, right? And so it's funny because, we're both engineers. Earlier in our career, we worked on submarine design. And in some ways, that was much more black and white, right? You've got the laws of physics and Mother Nature that are going to tell you what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And that's how you design your thing, right? Your physical object or your device. In the software world with users, it's like much more gray and fuzzy, right? You've got millions of potential users. And that's part of why actually the foundation of the product market fit pyramid is target customer. Everything is a function of the target customer. If you're going to build it for this kind of user, then a certain set of probabilities in physics are going to apply, and if you build it for these other users, a different set are going to apply, right? So that's kind of how I like to think about it. And so that's why really getting clear on who's the customer. And then another big important thing I didn't touch on yet in this is just, it's very common for product teams and companies to just rush to solutions. Hey, I think we should build this thing. I think everyone's going to love it, right? As opposed to starting out with problems. Okay, who's the customer and what's their pain point? What's their problem? We'll get to solutions in a minute, but it's kind of like when you go straight to a solution, it's like ready, fire, aim. You're making you don't even realize you're making these assumptions and you're skipping these key steps about what really is the problem that we're trying to do.
So it sounds like start with who's your customer, what's the problem you're trying to solve, what's your current point of view on success, and then frame your first set of effort as your first hypothesis.
Once you decide, okay, we think, after you kind of pick the problems, you come up with a point of view about what your value proposition is going to be. How are we going to solve these problems in a way that's better or different than what's already out there? You identify your minimum feature set, your MVP. Mm-hmm. And then a key step is many companies still today, the next thing they do is they go and build it. And that's risky. That's like the riskiest thing you can do. I know you like this too, is I like to prototype it and then go test it because it's so easy. You've probably got so many things wrong you don't even realize. Like there's the saying, like, no business plan survives first contact with a customer. Same thing, no first prototype. I've got numerous examples of pivots that have happened over time where somebody thought, oh, it's going to be great, and then you go out and talk to customers like, actually, it's not so good. But let me tell you about this other thing. So it's almost like the longer I work here, the longer I want to get to first contact with the customer with the prototype as soon as possible, because that's when the learning really starts to the next level.
That's a good summary. Let me extend that. So you talked about quantitative and qualitative. With respect to quantitative, you talked about different types of metrics, and then the context. You also talked about different phases of maturity. Mm-hmm. Could you speak a little bit and help our audience think about different types of quantitative metrics that might be applicable at different phases? Of understanding you don't generally have metrics for qualitative, and how you might think about qualitative in the different phases.
Right. Yeah. Let me share my screen again and share something, because the way I like to pitch this to kind of show, let me actually present, to show this metric that matters most is I like to present a simplified little thought experiment, right? And so let me just do that real quick with everybody. So let's say, we've just launched a new product. We just launched a new product and we're having a debate among our team of, hey, do we think we should go focus on optimizing acquisition first, or conversion first, or retention first? And there may be different people in the company advocating for each of these. I would argue for most businesses, there's a logical order to do these in, right? And the way I like to kind of reconcile it or explain it is with the leaky bucket analogy. A lot of people refer to leaky bucket syndrome or leaky bucket, but you don't actually see it explained. So I want to explain it. And a simple way to explain it is you think about a bucket, right? And it's got some water in it, basically, right? So here's a kid spraying a hose at the bucket. His aim isn't perfect, so not all the water is getting in there, right? So how does this have to do with what we're talking about? Well, the water that he's spraying out of the hose, those are your prospective customers. And the ones that he managed to get in the bucket, it's not 100%. That's basically your customers, right? That's the idea of a bucket, right? You're trying to acquire people, and unfortunately, the aim isn't that great. So conversion is what percentage of the water goes into the bucket. Acquisition is basically like, okay, how much water are we spraying? Is it a little trickle or is it a big fire hose? Like, what's the volume of water that we're spraying? That's what acquisition is. And then finally, retention is, hey, we losing customers over time. How much are we holding on to? How leaky is our bucket, right? That's the idea. So that's kind of a physical metaphor for acquisition, conversion, retention. Now, here's the thing. We can turn the fire hose on, but if we've got a leaky bucket, it's all just going to leak out anyway, right? That's the thing, right? And part of the problem you see with vanity metrics sometimes is when you look at active users, if you've got healthy acquisition going on, it may mask the fact you have a retention problem. So what you need to do is turn off the hose, watch what happens to the bucket and see how quickly it drains out. So anyway, bottom line is, usually for most businesses, it makes the most sense to first focus on retention. Because again, when you first start, your product's probably not going to have great retention. So focus on getting your retention where it needs to be. It's not going to get to 100. It's not going to get to 0%. Nobody has that, right? But where you get to the point of diminishing returns, then you can focus on conversion rate optimization up to a point, so that by the time you go then to do acquisition, you're going to get a much higher ROI, right? Because more of that water is going to land in the bucket, and it's going to stay in that bucket longer. So that's kind of how I think about it. And what that really means, and I like to ask this question too, is hey, if we just launched a new product and you only had one metric to track product market fit, what would it be? The way I like the answer, I get a lot of different answers, like NPS or revenue or daily active users or retention rate, and one of the things I like to point out is when people say NPS, I go back to that framework. Is NPS attitudinal or behavioral data? It's attitudinal because people are telling us if they would recommend it, right? They're not actually, we're not tracking if they did or not, right? So Spock, back to the analytics, he doesn't like humans telling him one thing and doing something else. He doesn't want to get tricked by the silly humans. He's like, I'm going to look at your behavior. I'm not going to trust anything that comes out of their mouth. I'm going to look at their behavior. So what we want is a behavioral way of doing this. And the way I like to answer this, the essence of product market fit for me, you can kind of think about in another thought experiment, think about all the movies you've seen in your life. Maybe it's hundreds, thousands, right? Now think about the number of movies you've seen 5 or more times. It's a lot shorter to list. It's the ones that you like the most, right? Same thing with restaurants. We eat more than we go to movies, but think of all the restaurants you've been to versus the ones you've been to 10 or more times, right? That's the basic thing. If we see a user come and use our product and never come back and use it again, Spock's pretty confident that he can infer from that, what? We must not have met their needs. We must not have created enough value for them because they came, they used it, they kicked the tires, and they left. In contrast, if a user comes in, uses the product, and then we see him come back the next day and the next day and the next week, we can infer, oh my gosh, they must be getting value because they keep coming back. So that thing of once somebody tries your product, if they choose to come back or not, that's a great signal that you've got product market fit. And the way we track that is retention rate. You're just tracking what percentage of customers are still active over time. You get a retention curve, right, where you've got the percentage of users returning over time. One way to think about this, back to the bucket analogy, is this is plotting the water level in the bucket over time. How quickly does your bucket leak over time? And you'll notice I didn't draw this all the way to 100%. I could have. It just would have been a bunch of white space that would have made the graph harder to read, right? So if you go back to that bucket analogy, you start the bucket at 100%, you turn off the hose at the top, and you watch how quickly the water drains out. And what happens at the end, it drops really sharply. Eventually, this slope flattens out. And one of two things happen. Either flattens out to some lower value, which is the nice scenario, or it goes to 0. And honestly, for most new products, it goes to 0, right? And at the end of the day, that is the measure of product market fit, right? I remember one time I gave a talk and I shared a case study where we used qualitative data and prototypes to iterate a product. And at the end of the talk, someone said, how many users did you talk to in your survey, in your study? I'm like, we talked to 20. And the person looked at me and said, that's not statistically significant. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're right. How many should I have talked to? She's like, 1,000. And then I was like, wait a minute, are you sure that's enough? She's like, no, you're right, 10,000. I'm like, okay, let's just take a deep breath. how long would it have taken for me to do 10,000 one-on-one customer interviews, right? So it's just like the wrong tool for the job. But this is how you know, if your retention curve goes to 0, you do not have product market fit. If it flattens out, the higher up that percentage is, the better the product market fit that you have. So back to this graph, you want to do, in phase 1, you want to basically, in phase 2, phase 1 and phase 2, you want to basically get to the point where your curve, right? If we go back to this graph, you're going to try to do everything you can with prototypes here so that when you get here, your retention is as good as it can be. But now you have real users, and this is where you want to get the retention curves and look at it and get it from 0 to non-zero, basically. That's what you want to do in this phase, right? And then in phase 3, we can talk about that more. There's growth metrics for users, and there's growth metrics for revenue as well.
That's a great bullseye, retention rate. We use that as our primary metric. I hadn't thought about it as being the product market fit metric, but our primary metric at Heap as well.
Yeah.
You talked about quantitative and qualitative as a core part of your overview today and how they complement each other. How have you do you have some practical examples of how you've seen product teams develop an effective dual set of metrics and approaches to get complementarity between quantitative metrics and qualitative?
Like I said, they complement each other, right? And they complement each other. So a lot of times you'll start, very common to start in quant, and you'll recognize that there's a problem. It's almost like you see some smoke, like it's like a fire. There's some fire and there's some smoke. You don't know what's causing the fire, right? Like you might have a low drop off. I'll share some data real quick of an optimization where we weren't getting the conversion rate we wanted. It was like a bad conversion rate. So we knew that there was a lot of smoke. We didn't know what was causing the fire. What caused the fire? We don't know. So we had to switch, right? And go say, well, let's go actually talk to watch users going through this is before the days of screen recording. So we just did a usability study, right? So let me quickly walk people through that as an example of where we started in quant, right? So here we launched a new product and it kind of had a long sign up process. So this is basically tracking what percent, and this is actually the abandonment rate. It's the opposite of conversion rate. What percentage of people did not make it through the whole process? And it was financial related. So unfortunately it was multiple pages and longer than we would have liked, but it was our V1 effort. And so we were tracking what percentage of people were leaving, with a 7-day average. So, over 60% of people were not getting it through this flow and therefore not becoming customers. That's pretty bad, right? I mean, 60%, that's pretty bad, right? And in general, conversion rate, people use this term all the time. Just to define it real quick, it's basically like if there's 100% of users that have the ability to take an action, what percentage actually took that action? So it's like comparing that ratio. So you can have a bunch of different conversions rate, right? So we knew that the overall end-to-end of this multi-step process conversion rate was 60%. So the first thing we did is say, okay, well, let's break it down and look at the drop-off at each of the various steps to see if there's one step that's worse than the others where we need to focus. Is there more smoke being generated by one of these steps, right? So here's the various steps with the drop-off as we went down. And again, this is a lesson in metrics that matters most thinking. If you can address the biggest drop, that's going to have the biggest impact, right? If you go focus on a little drop, it's not going to have as big of an impact. So we focused on the biggest drop. We use metric that matters most thinking to say, okay, this is the biggest drop right here. Let's go double click on that and see what's going on. And we're still in the quant world, right? And we're just kind of double clicking and peeling in the quant world. Next thing we did is say, okay, let's look at the flow there, right? So when you open an account, if you don't already have a login, you have to register. Or if you already have a login for the website, you can sign in. So we saw what percentage of traffic went each way. And then, for the people that are registering, I kind of put in red the things that were really bad. 45% of people that were going down this flow were dropping off here. And as a percentage of the total water, 20% of people were dropping off here, right? Back on this flow, on the sign-in flow, basically all these people, because we'd kind of increased the security, we made people that used to be able to use like a remember me login, we made them have to explicitly log in. And like most people don't remember their password, right? They forgot their password. And so 17% of people dropped off there, which is 10% of total, right? And then, then there was a whole change. If their password wasn't secure enough, they had to go change it. We lost another 20% there. And then finally you get to the end, right? So we kind of analyze this to identify where the biggest drop-offs happening, right? And so we could prioritize this. That's as far as we got with quant. Quant, we saw where the different smoke, the little fire where the smokes were. We didn't have any idea why. But what we then did is we went out and we did usability research. Here, this is 20% of people. So mainly focused on this, secondarily focused on this. We found out what the usability issues were. We actually did a separate thing where we categorized users because users had different categories of which state they were in, whether they had to do this or this. And we kind of did like a 80-20 kind of analysis on, hey, if we make solve these UX challenges, then it's going to impact the biggest number of people. So we rolled out the new design and we were able to significantly improve. Now, it still wasn't where we wanted it to be, but it was significant improvement. So it's an example where we started in quant, double click to like isolate the problem as much as we could in quant. And then we switched to usability to figure out what the issues were, did a new design, rolled it out, and then used quant again to quantify the improvement that we had made. One example of how we went from quant to qual. How do you guys like to do it at Heap?
Oh, thanks for asking the question. We definitely have a point of view on that, Dan. If you could actually go back a slide to, here we go. The way we think about this at Heap is we have a way in our products of doing a similar quantitative analysis as this. So we're very aligned with you in terms of starting with the quant and statistically significant numbers and where the key points of drop off. And then rather than go into usability testing, though I think that's a fantastic tool and I've used it many times, I'm going to actually take over and share a screen here for a second. We start with the quantitative analysis, which you showed with the drop off in the different steps. That would commonly be referred to as product analytics, which is where Heap started, where you're looking at the drop off and the performance step by step. Once you identify those points of friction within the journey where people are getting stuck, then you want to, as you said, with user testing, better understand what's going on there. Another way to do that with technology is over here in Session Replay, where the way we do it with technology is to then watch specific sessions that are representative and located at that points of drop off. So you can observe people succeeding, people struggling at those drop off points. The way we do it in our product is that it's actually fully integrated. So you can get the analysis quantitatively and then watch qualitatively, and then roll over to voice of the customer and actually read quotes and feedback of people who are experiencing that pain. So it's all contextual. And you've got that quantitative and qualitative lens integrated at one point in time for user analysis.
I think that's great because it's obviously faster. You know, it's kind of like you've already got a data set you can look at. You don't have to go and recruit users for usability study and do the usability study. So I think that's awesome. So that if you have those you see the smoke and you want to figure out what's causing the fire, you can go right to those session recordings and the VOC to get that data. And if, hopefully that gives you enough insight to solve the problem. If there's still more stuff, then you could then go to the extra effort of going out and talking to people. But I bet you in a lot of cases, you probably get enough insight from those two tools that it will make your time to insight, time to solution will be a lot shorter.
Exactly. So most cases you get what you need there. And then if you need the interaction, which is what you get in a user interview,
right.
You don't get through those technologies.
Right.
You would then go to a user interview so you could ask questions and do a back and forth and dig more deeply into why people are doing what they're doing. On slide 15 of your presentation, I noticed that you suggested that builders should identify the highest ROI idea. How would you coach people to identify and find the idea that in fact is highest ROI?
It's a conceptual idea, and of course, no one would say, yeah, let's do the low ROI idea. So the real question is, how do you do that, right? And so let me pull this up again. Once you've picked the metric your team thinks offers the highest ROI, what's the highest ROI idea? So there's basically two things to do, right? There's two ROI analyses. Here you got to kind of say which metric do we think offers highest ROI, and then for that metric, what's the highest ROI idea? And ROI is something that gets thrown around pretty loosely a lot. And it's interesting because there are actually multiple ways that people try to prioritize. And I was just teaching a workshop the other day, and someone pulled up some multifactorial spreadsheet where there were 7 different factors, and each one had a weight, and they were scoring. And I understand on the one hand the appeal of that, but what happens, the end is losing. It's like you have no idea how the sausage is getting made, and you can't explain to someone why this is number one. So I like to keep it simple with ROI. And so, let me pull up a slide here that's got that. Here's ROI. Basically, you've got some measure of return and some measure of investments, right? And what happens is the return when you're pre-launch, it can be hard to estimate. It's kind of fuzzy. It's like, oh, customer value, When you're post-launch, I'll show you this in a sec, you can actually usually, the common denominator can be revenue improvement, right? You can actually, and I'll talk in a second about how you can do that. But bottom line is you have some measure of value, right? And you got some measure of investment, and the investment is usually people weeks or people time, some metrics of people time. And usually we just simplify it to developer time. It doesn't mean that no one else's time is important, but it's really complicated to track multiple resource pools of time. And usually the resource pools of the other people are proportional. So basically, you just estimate these ideas, and then you can calculate the ROI ends up being the slope, and you can calculate the ideas. And, you know, like if you've got two ideas here where they've got similar return, but one's going to take twice as long, it's kind of a no-brainer to do A over B because it's twice the ROI, right? So in those situations, it's pretty clear. And it's funny because you don't actually care about the ROI number. You just want to know which of these should be prioritized first or second. What happens a lot, this is pretty easy. When you've got clear ROI differences, it's easy. What happens a lot is you get ideas that have same or very similar ROIs. Like this is idea C is 2 for 2 for an ROI of 1. Idea D 4 for 4 ROI of 1 as well. So ROI is not gonna tell you which one to do first because they're gonna be tied. So not always, but in general, I like to usually go for the smaller scope idea because one, it's gonna get out there and in people's hands and generate whatever value you're hoping to generate sooner. The other thing is, you know, whenever we're estimating in scope, there's always scope estimation error. And the way that it works is it's nonlinear. So even though D is estimated to be twice as much as C, the error band for this is going to have a longer tail and probably take longer. There are obviously bad ideas out there. It's just as valuable to rule out bad ideas. Nobody wants to do a bad idea on purpose. They think it's going to be up here at D. But back to what we were saying, they have all these hypotheses that and assumptions they never validated. And so they thought it was going to create a lot of value. They felt the investment as they were building it. And basically they launched it and found out it wasn't as valuable. And what product teams want to do is, you know, use these techniques of quant and qual research to identify, hey, what are the really high ROI ideas? And then they can work with work with the dev team, because usually when you first come up with an idea, you can break it down into different components, and almost 80-20 is often at play. So you can easily shave off some of the investment and maintain most of the return. And then you can just kind of sort ideas by ROI, right? Now, what the common footing, you know, when you're talking about fuzzy customer value in phase one, it can be a little fuzzy. I do have a framework I'm not going to get into here of importance versus satisfaction as a way to quantify customer value that you can use. But really the best way to put different ideas on an even keel here, for example, if you had, say your team has some ideas that are going to improve this conversion rate, and some ideas are going to improve, say, retention, and some ideas that are going to improve like average revenue per user. How do we balance these different ideas, right? Well, that's where, you know, I mentioned back to the startup metrics for pirates that every business has to contend with retention, activation, and acquisition, right? Revenue is where now different revenue models have different companies have different revenue models. So that's where you have to kind of get very specific to your company. And that's where the concept that I talk about, the equation of your business, comes in, right? And it's a way to express the key metrics for your revenue model for your business so that we can have a discussion and as a team identify the ROI. So, well, let me just illustrate it really quickly for a subscription business model. Basically, you can always start with profit equals revenue minus cost, right? That applies to every business. And then the idea is you want to break down your revenue. Usually this is focused on revenue optimization. You could also do it on the cost side, is break down the revenue into terms that are more meaningful and actionable. Like if we just say, hey team, grow revenue, that's super high level and they're not going to know what to do, right? So for a subscription business, I lost my top there. Hold on a second, let's go back. For a subscription business, you know, in a given month, what determines revenue? And there's no one right way to do this, but one way to determine the revenue is to say, well, it's how many users paid us times the average revenue per paying user, right? So the idea is you're just substituting this term. So you're replacing revenue with these two terms, right? Well, how many paying users did we have last month? Well, one way to break it down is there were some new paying users that paid us for the first time, plus people that paid us, but that wasn't the first time they paid us, repeat paying users, right? And it's almost always beneficial to distinguish between new and repeat paying users. And then, well, what's repeat paying users? Well, it's just how many paying users do we have in the previous month times 1 minus some churn rate or cancellation rate, right? And back on the paying users, how do we, you know, let's say we have a free trial. How many trial users do we get times some conversion rate from the trial? And we can go on to break it down. Well, how did we get the trial? You know, what channels do we get the trial users from? And what was the conversion rate for each channel? So we can break it down. But now we can have a discussion and say, okay, do we think it's, you know, highest ROI to increase ARPU, you know, increase the trial conversion rate, decrease the churn, right? optimize one of these other channels. And the cool thing about this now is, let's say we have an idea that's going to increase ARPU by 5%. Well, now we know what it's going to do for revenue because it's just a multiplication. So it's just, if we have an idea that we estimate is going to increase ARPU by 5%, it's going to increase revenue by 5%. And you can use that to have different, to do apples to apples comparisons, bring everything back to revenue for all these different micro metrics like cancellation rate or conversion rate. So you can then say, okay, that's the value on the ROI axis. We're going to use revenue, expected revenue increase here, and you can have an apples to apples comparison basically.
So it sounds like that the keys here are, some takeaways are, one, just the framework, just think this way in terms of this X and Y axis, and that's a way to facilitate a conversation and a trade-off conversation with your team. And then the second is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and that you're not trying to dial in on literally the precise spreadsheet driven ROI. You're not trying to do a net present value on this. But you're trying to get, an order of magnitude estimate and relative comparison of ROI.
Yeah, and I love that. One of my favorite sayings is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We don't want to get into analysis paralysis here. It's like there's uncertainty bands on everything, even with the equation of your business. You're estimating, we think this is going to grow revenue by 5%. Who knows? It might be 1, it might be 10. Who knows, right? So you want to, definitely get your ideas out there and go through that learning iteration loop, because that's the key, is how many different experiments can you get done, right?
Dan, again, thanks very much for the ROI example and the framework. I'll add that in using some of the toolkits of today, you can use product analytics to better understand drop-off as a way of looking at ROI, as well as invoking session replay and VOC to get some of that contextual data and qualitative data to also inform your ROI.
I think that's really important because, they're all estimates, right? And so if you have an idea and says, hey, we think by redesigning this flow, we're going to get a 10% improvement. Well, why do you think that? Well, if you know what the drop off is right now, and you've read the VOC comments, you're going to be able to much better estimate what the expected improvement's going to be versus just kind of, winging it. So I think that those kind of the data that comes from those tools can help you make better kind of return estimates to help you prioritize.
Well, Dan, thank you very much. This has been great. Great to see you in this forum after all these years of working together. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, enjoyed Dan.